Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a journey. Not to the grand tournaments or the romanticized castles of medieval lore, but straight into the dark, often terrifying, heart of its justice system. Imagine this: you're a common peasant, or perhaps a struggling artisan, living in a small, mud and timber village somewhere in 13th century Europe. A simple misunderstanding, a moment of desperation, or perhaps a genuine act of malice has led you down a dangerous path. You've committed a crime, or, even worse, you've been accused of one. There are no police sirens wailing, no bright lights of interrogation rooms, no smooth-talking lawyers. Instead, justice is a shadowy, often arbitrary force, dictated by powerful men, ancient customs, and sometimes even by divine intervention. You probably won't survive this system with your dignity intact, or perhaps even your life. But we're going to dive into what truly happened if you were a criminal in medieval times. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling adventurous, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you guys are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a world utterly unlike your own. A world where the concept of law is not a universal, codified set of rules, but a bewildering patchwork quilt of local customs, feudal obligations, and the sometimes whimsical will of your immediate lord. The very notion of justice is fluid, shifting from one manor to the next, from one town to another, from the jurisdiction of a secular lord to that of the church. There's no single, centralized government enforcing a uniform legal code across vast territories. Instead, every village, every town, every noble's estate might have its own particular way of resolving disputes and punishing transgressions. It's like trying to play a board game where every player has their own rule book, and the rules change depending on whose turn it is. Your life, as a common person, is largely dictated by tradition and the local power structure. If a wrong has been committed, your first recourse, or the first authority to pursue you, is likely to be your village elders, or perhaps the local reeve, a sort of village manager or bailiff. But for anything more serious, or if the initial informal mediation fails, you're looking at the Lord's Court, a place where true justice can feel like a distant dream, replaced by arbitrary power and often brutal outcomes. The long arm of the law in the Middle Ages wasn't just long, it was often crooked, slow, and incredibly painful. One mainstream historical fact that immediately complicates any modern understanding of medieval legal process is that the medieval justice system was highly decentralized, fragmented, and largely based on customary law, local feudal authority, and ecclesiastical church courts, rather than a unified national legal code, making justice often inconsistent, deeply influenced by social status, and highly localized. There was no single justice system covering all of medieval Europe, but a myriad of overlapping and often conflicting jurisdictions, each with its own procedures, biases, and punishments. Think about it. A single crime could, theoretically, be tried in multiple different ways, by multiple different authorities. A particularly quirky tidbit that reflects the casual brutality and local nature of justice is the common sight of local punishment devices prominently displayed in market squares or near castle gates. These weren't just gallows for executions, but often stocks and pillories, or even ducking stools, used for public shaming and minor punishments. These were symbols of the Lord's direct power, a constant reminder of what happened if you stepped out of line. Imagine walking through your town square on a Tuesday morning and seeing someone's head and hands locked in a wooden frame for public mockery, pelted with rotten fruit, or a scolding woman being repeatedly dunked into a pond, and that's just for minor offenses like gossiping or selling bad bread. Historians still argue whether the prominent and public nature of medieval punishments was primarily designed to deter crime through fear and highly visible public humiliation, serving as a powerful and unforgettable warning to a largely illiterate population, or if it also satisfied a societal desire for spectacle and retribution, providing a grim form of entertainment in an era with limited distractions and a thirst for dramatic displays. Was it about deterring crime, or simply satisfying the public's thirst for a show? As you navigate this system, perhaps as an unfortunate suspect or a terrified observer, you quickly realize that your social standing is paramount. If you're a serf, tied to the land, your rights are minimal, and your fate is largely in the hands of your lord, who might see you more as a piece of property than an individual with rights. If you're a freeman, you might have slightly more recourse, but still limited power against the entrenched authority of the nobility. And if you're a noble yourself, the rules might bend considerably in your favor, allowing you to pay a fine, we'll get to that, or opt for trial by combat, a specific duel. Or conversely, your crimes might be met with an even harsher, more symbolic punishment due to your higher status and the greater expectation placed upon you. There's no equality before the law as you know it. Justice wears a different face for every social class. And often, that face is grim. The legal proceedings themselves are far from the orderly, evidence-based trials you're accustomed to. They might take place outdoors, in a muddy field, or in the cramped, smoky great hall of a castle. There are no professional lawyers to represent you, a major problem we'll discuss, no forensic evidence, and often, no concept of innocent until proven guilty in the modern sense. Instead, your fate might rest on an oath, a duel, or even a bizarre, terrifying test of divine judgment, placing your life entirely at the mercy of chance or God's inscrutable will. You feel the constant unease, the low hum of anxiety, knowing that a simple accusation, a misinterpreted act, or merely being at the wrong place at the wrong time could plunge you into this terrifying legal labyrinth. The sun might be shining, and the birds might be singing, but the shadow of medieval justice, arbitrary and brutal, looms large over every aspect of your life, a constant reminder that your actions, however small, could lead to immense, terrifying consequences. And you're about to discover just how profoundly it sucked to be a criminal, or even just accused, in the Middle Ages. Having just grasped the fragmented and arbitrary nature of medieval law, your first brush with its true terror comes not from a formal summons, but from something far more insidious. The accusation rumor and suspicion. Forget warrants and due process. In the tightly knit, often superstitious communities of the Middle Ages, a whisper, a false word, or even a perceived slight could quickly escalate into a public accusation, transforming you overnight from an ordinary person into a pariah. Hunted by fear and the collective will of your neighbors, you quickly learn that your reputation is your most fragile shield, and that suspicion, once kindled, can spread like wildfire, consuming your good name and often your very life. Long before any formal judgment, it's like being caught in a permanent game of telephone. But the message is always that you're a criminal, and the consequences are terrifyingly real. You wake one morning, perhaps to the cold dread of a neighbor's averted gaze, or a sudden, hushed silence as you walk into the village market. People who once greeted you warmly now clutch their children closer or quickly turn their backs. Whispers follow you like a chilling breeze, a missing tool from the smithy, a cow that fell mysteriously ill, or a strange shadow seen near the Lord's granary. Your heart begins to pound, a cold knot tightening in your stomach, as the vague murmurs coalesce around you. One mainstream historical fact that utterly defines the terrifying power of the informal in medieval justice is that in medieval communities, public accusation, often fueled by rumor, suspicion, and personal grudges, frequently served as the initial and most powerful form of indictment, severely damaging an individual's reputation and often leading directly to arrest, informal punishment, or formal trial by local authorities, regardless of actual evidence. Your guilt was often decided by public opinion before a judge even saw you. Think about it. Your fate could be sealed by what your nosy neighbor believes, not what you actually did. Imagine the source of the accusation. It might be a disgruntled rival in the village, seeking revenge for a past slight. Perhaps a superstitious neighbor blames you for their misfortune. A blighted crop. A sick family member remember those invisible killers? Disease. From Why You Wouldn't Survive a Day in Ancient Egypt. They were often blamed on others, or a powerful figure, a local lord or his bailiff, might simply take a dislike to you, and any minor infraction, or even a fabricated one, could become a convenient excuse for your downfall. The motivation for the accusation might be malice, fear, or a desperate need to find a scapegoat for inexplicable events. A particularly quirky tidbit that highlights the pervasive nature of rumor and suspicion is the concept of hue and cry. If a crime, especially theft or assault, was witnessed, the victim or a witness would raise a loud hue and cry, and all able-bodied men in the village were legally obligated to join the pursuit of the suspected criminal. Imagine an entire village suddenly turning into an impromptu mob, chasing you through fields and alleys, simply because someone shouted, "Thief," and pointed in your direction. Historians still argue whether the hue and cry system, by relying on community participation for immediate law enforcement, inadvertently fostered a strong sense of collective responsibility and informal justice that kept petty crime in check, or if it also often led to arbitrary arrests, mob justice, and the unjust persecution of innocent individuals who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time and couldn't explain themselves due to the language barrier. As we've seen before, did it deter crime or just create chaos? The lack of formal policing beyond a few local constables or the Lord's armed retainers meant that communities often policed themselves, and public opinion became a powerful, often brutal, form of social control. Once suspicion fell upon you, it was incredibly difficult to shake off. Your reputation, painstakingly built over a lifetime, could crumble in a matter of hours. People would shun you, refuse to trade with you, or even refuse to work with you. Your very presence would become a mark of suspicion. The accusation, once formally lodged perhaps by a village elder or by the Lord's bailiff after a complaint, would quickly bring you before the local authorities. There's no complex investigation, no gathering of forensic evidence. The very fact that an accusation has been made, particularly by someone of standing, often carries significant weight, pushing you immediately into the harsh glare of medieval justice, a terrifying progression from whispered rumor to public indictment. You feel the cold fear gripping your stomach, the frantic beating of your heart, as you realize the whispers are about you. You try to protest, to explain, but your voice is lost in the rising tide of suspicion, the collective gaze of your neighbors, now transformed into a judging crowd. The awful truth about being a criminal in medieval times isn't just about the punishments, it's about the terrifying power of the accusation. Your good name, your livelihood, and your very freedom could be instantly threatened by rumor and suspicion, forcing you into a desperate battle against an invisible, all-consuming tide of fear and prejudice, making every quiet glance and every hushed whisper a prelude to potential ruin. Having been swept up by the chilling tide of rumor and public suspicion, your next stop on the grim path of medieval justice will almost certainly be the heart of local power. Local courts' lords' justice. Forget the distant, imposing figure of a king or a centralized legal system. For the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages, justice was a deeply personal affair, administered directly by the local lord whose lands you lived on, and whose word was, quite literally, law. You quickly learned that your fate, your rights, and your very life are utterly dependent on the whims, biases, and sometimes terrifying capriciousness of the man who holds power over your village. It's like living in a small town where the mayor is also the judge, the police chief, and the executioner. And he can change the rules based on how he feels that day, with no one to appeal to. You find yourself summoned to the Lord's manor or castle, perhaps to a smoky great hall, or a modest chamber where justice is dispensed. The air is thick with the smell of stale rushes, wood smoke from the hearth, and the lingering scent of damp earth and unwashed bodies. The Lord sits, perhaps on a raised dais, surrounded by his knights, household retainers, and the occasional clerk. He is not a trained legal professional as you know it, like a modern judge with a law degree. He is primarily a warrior, a landowner, and his authority stems from his military power, his inherited lineage, and his ability to enforce his will through brute force if necessary. His understanding of law is a blend of inherited local custom, pragmatic necessity for maintaining order on his estate, and whatever he deems expedient for his own interests or mood at that moment. One mainstream historical fact that completely redefines the concept of legal fairness in this era is that in medieval feudalism, local lords held significant judicial power over their tenants and serfs, administering justice directly in manorial courts based on local customs and their own discretion, often with little formal oversight from higher authorities, making justice profoundly localized, inconsistent, and highly vulnerable to the individual prejudices or moods of the lord. This meant that a fair trial, as you understand it, was a rare luxury. Think about it, your entire legal future depends on whether your lord had a good breakfast or a bad temper that morning. Imagine presenting your case. You speak in hushed tones, perhaps kneeling, your eyes fixed on the lord's face, trying to gauge his mood. There are no formal lawyers to present your intricate argument, no complex legal precedents you can cite from a dusty law book, because such books rarely exist for customary law. Your best hope is to speak clearly, honestly, and to gain the Lord's sympathy, or a sense of his favor. Your social standing, your family's reputation, and your personal relationship with the Lord or his immediate family or influential retainers could dramatically influence the outcome. If you were a favored craftsman whose skills were essential to the manor, your case might be heard with more leniency than if you were a troublesome serf who often argued about his feudal duties or caused disruptions. A particularly quirky tidbit that demonstrates the Lord's sometimes arbitrary power, even over minor offenses, is the medieval concept of amercement. This was a fine imposed at the Lord's discretion for various minor offenses or failures, often with no fixed amount. The Lord could literally impose a higher or lower fine based on his personal judgment of the offense, your attitude, or simply whether he liked your face that day. Imagine being fined for a small infraction like a stray pig, and the judge just picks a random amount of money out of his head based on whether he thinks you look contrite, or whether he needs a new cloak this month. Historians still argue whether the arbitrary nature of feudal justice, despite its obvious flaws and potential for injustice, inadvertently fostered stronger community cohesion and informal dispute resolution within villages as people tried to avoid the Lord's court and settle things amongst themselves, or if it primarily served as a tool of oppression, maintaining the social hierarchy and economically exploiting the lower classes through unpredictable punishments and fines, thereby reinforcing the Lord's dominance. Did it build community, or just create fear and subservience? The punishments dispensed by the Lord could be swift and brutal, often without possibility of appeal to a higher court, at least for common folk. For minor offenses, it might be a small fine. Remember that concept of vergeld, where payment could often avert harsher penalties, something largely for the wealthy, which we'll cover later, or public humiliation in the stocks or pillory, as we discussed in the intro, and we'll see more of later in Section 9's public humiliation. For more serious crimes, it could be a severe flogging, mutilation like cutting off an ear or a hand. A grim reality we'll also confront later, or even summary execution, all administered directly by the Lord's appointed bailiff, reeve, or the local executioner. Remember that miserable fellow. His job was tied to these lords. The Lord's word was final, and any defiance could be met with overwhelming force from his armed retainers, making rebellion a near suicidal act. The very concept of what constituted a crime could also feel arbitrary to your modern sensibilities. Disputes over property lines, boundaries of a field, stolen livestock, poaching in the Lord's private forest, or even speaking ill of the Lord or his family could all be brought before him. The evidence might be flimsy, based largely on rumors. Remember those from Section 2. Personal testimony from a neighbor who might have a grudge, or simply the Lord's own suspicions. And his decision often relied more on his personal intuition, entrenched biases, or what he deemed convenient for managing his domain and asserting his authority. You feel the cold sweat on your brow, the frantic beating of your heart, as the Lord fixes you with his gaze. You try to speak, your voice trembling, acutely aware that your entire future, your livelihood, and perhaps that of your family, hangs precariously on the mood and the judgment of this single, powerful man. The awful truth about justice in the Middle Ages isn't just about its inherent brutality. It's about the pervasive, arbitrary power of feudal lords. Your legal fate was often determined by the personal whims of your local ruler, turning every transgression into a terrifying gamble, where true fairness was a luxury rarely afforded to the common person, and the long shadow of his personal judgment fell heavy and unpredictably over every aspect of your miserable, unprotected life. When the local lord's judgment proved insufficient, the evidence remained unclear, or the crime was deemed too grave for simple human arbitration. Medieval justice often turned to a terrifying and seemingly inexplicable arbiter trial by ordeal divine gamble. Forget logical arguments, witness cross-examination, or modern forensic evidence. In this era, proving innocence or guilt for serious accusations often involved submitting to a harrowing physical test, where the outcome was believed to be dictated not by human reason, but by the direct, miraculous intervention of God. You quickly learn that your fate might hinge not on facts, but on whether your skin heals cleanly or if you can hold your breath long enough, turning your trial into a desperate, agonizing gamble with the divine, where the odds are often stacked terrifyingly against you. It's like playing a game of Russian roulette, but with God pulling the trigger, and your life, or your soul, is the only bullet. You stand accused of a serious crime, perhaps murder, arson, perjury, or even a grave theft, a crime for which there are no clear witnesses or definitive proof in the human realm, the Lord, or the presiding cleric. If it's an ecclesiastical matter, remember those church courts we'll get to. They often used these too. Pronounces the chilling decision you must undergo an ordeal. A wave of cold, absolute fear washes over you, knowing that this is not a test of strength or cunning, but a direct appeal to supernatural judgment, and your very essence is on trial before the Almighty. The air around the ordeal site, whether it's within the consecrated ground of a church, a riverbank, or a blacksmith's forge, is thick with a heavy, solemn tension, broken only by murmured prayers and the anxious breaths of onlookers, who genuinely believe they are witnessing God's will. One mainstream historical fact that utterly defines the arbitrary nature of medieval justice for centuries is that trial by ordeal, particularly by hot iron, hot water, or cold water, was a widely practiced method for determining guilt or innocence for serious crimes across medieval Europe, based on the deeply held belief that God would miraculously intervene to protect the innocent and condemn the guilty, serving as a final, unappealable judgment in the absence of clear human evidence. This practice was deeply intertwined with religious faith and customary law. Think about it. Your innocence is decided by whether boiling water scalds you or not, or if a piece of iron burns you. Imagine the grim preparation for an ordeal by hot iron. A piece of iron, perhaps a plowshare, a simple bar, or a ring, is heated to a glowing red over a roaring fire, often located within the consecrated ground of a church or a monastery. Priests would perform elaborate rituals and prayers, blessing the iron, imbuing it with divine judgment. You are made to approach, your heart pounding, your skin crawling. You might be forced to carry this searing hot iron in your bare hand for a specified distance, perhaps 3 paces, or 9 paces, or even to walk barefoot over several pieces of glowing iron. The moment the hot metal touches your flesh, your skin immediately sizzles. The smell of burning flesh fills your nostrils, and excruciating, unimaginable pain shoots through your body. Your hand or foot is then immediately bandaged and sealed, often by the priest, with sacred cloths. 3 days later, the bandages are ceremonially removed before witnesses. If the wound is clean, healing, and shows no signs of festering or severe damage, you are declared innocent, miraculously spared by God. If it is infected, blistered, festering, or not healing cleanly, you're deemed guilty, condemned by divine will. The psychological pressure, the sheer physical agony of the burn, and the knowledge that your future hinges on the unpredictable process of natural wound infection, all combine into a terrifying ordeal designed to extract a truth, or a confession, through suffering. A particularly quirky tidbit that demonstrates the perverse logic and occasional potential for manipulation of these ordeals is the alleged practice of subtle influence by those administering the tests. A sympathetic priest might use a slightly cooler iron, or quickly bandage the wound with poultices that aided healing, hoping for a miracle for the accused. Conversely, a hostile one might heat the iron hotter, or use bandages that promoted infection, ensuring a guilty verdict. Imagine your life depending not just on God, but on the subjective sympathy or animosity of the cleric holding the hot poker, subtly tipping the divine scales. Historians still argue whether the outcomes of judicial ordeals were truly random, leaving everything to pure divine intervention and chance, or if human factors like the influence of the clergy, the physical resilience and preparation of the accused, or even subtle forms of cheating by either side often played a more significant, albeit unacknowledged, role in determining the verdict, making them less of a direct divine judgment and more of a brutal, often manipulated, test of endurance and faith. Did God decide, or did earthly bias subtly nudge the outcome? Then there's the ordeal by hot water. Your arm or hand is plunged into a cauldron of boiling water, and you must retrieve a specific object, perhaps a ring or a stone, from its depths. The scalding pain is immediate and profound, blistering your skin. Similar to the hot iron, the wound's healing after 3 days would determine your innocence or guilt. For accusations of a less severe nature, or for commoners whose social status did not permit the hot iron, there was the ordeal by cold water. You, often bound with ropes and a stone tied to you, would be thrown into a consecrated body of water, a lake, a pond, or a river. If you sank and remained submerged, you were deemed innocent as the pure water accepted you, allowing you to sink, proving your purity. If you floated, you were guilty as the pure water rejected you, meaning it repelled your sinful body. The perverse, chilling logic of this test, where innocence often meant drowning, made it a truly terrifying form of judgment, especially if the person couldn't swim or if their body density made floating inevitable. You feel the cold dread of the water or the searing heat of the fire, knowing that your life, your honor, and your very soul are on trial. You pray desperately. You plead silently. But ultimately, your fate rests on a theological gamble, a brutal test of faith and flesh. The onlookers watch in solemn, fearful silence, believing they are witnessing God's direct judgment, an unassailable truth revealed through suffering, a stark affirmation of divine justice. The recovery from an ordeal, even if you were found innocent, was a traumatic process. Severe burns, deep infections. Remember the pervasive disease from Section 11 of Why Building a Castle Sucked. And profound psychological scarring would be a constant reminder of the day your fate was decided by divine intervention. Many who were declared innocent would still die within days or weeks from the injuries sustained during the ordeal itself. A cruel twist of fate. The awful truth about justice in the Middle Ages isn't just about its brutality. It's about the terrifying, unpredictable nature of trial by ordeal. Your very survival hinged on a crude physical test interpreted by religious dogma, making innocence a matter of divine favor and brute endurance, rather than any logical proof or human evidence. A grim testament to a legal system that often preferred a terrifying gamble to rigorous inquiry, leaving countless lives utterly at the mercy of chance and faith. When divine intervention through the terrifying ordeal failed to establish a clear truth, or when the honor of a noble was too deeply affronted for any lesser form of resolution, medieval justice often turned to its most direct and brutal form. Trial by combat might makes right. Forget courtroom dramas, eloquent arguments, or subtle legal maneuvering. Here, truth was literally decided by the swing of a sword, the thrust of a lance, or the blunt force of a mace, with God ostensibly granting victory to the righteous party through physical prowess. you quickly learn that your ability to prove your innocence or your claim might hinge entirely on your skill with a weapon, your physical strength, and your sheer willingness to risk life and limb. Turning a legal dispute into a brutal, bloody duel. It's like settling a legal argument with a boxing match, but with actual, very sharp weapons. And the loser doesn't just get a black eye, they might just die. You stand at the edge of a designated combat arena, perhaps a cleared field within a castle bailey, or a specific lists ground prepared for the duel. The air is thick with anticipation, hushed by the solemnity of the occasion, punctuated by the nervous shuffling of the crowd. Before you, two individuals, the accuser and the accused, prepare for battle. Their appearance depends entirely on their social status and the nature of the dispute. They might be heavily armored knights on horseback, wielding lances and swords, or common men fighting on foot with more basic weapons like clubs, axes, or simple shields. This isn't a mere brawl, it's a formalized legal proceeding, a sanctioned duel where God's judgment is believed to manifest directly through the outcome of the fight, making it a sacred, yet horrifying, form of justice. One mainstream historical fact that utterly redefines the concept of evidence in medieval law is that trial by combat was a legally recognized and widely practiced method of dispute resolution across medieval Europe, particularly for serious accusations like treason, murder, or honor disputes that couldn't be resolved otherwise, where the outcome of a duel between the accuser and accused or their champions was believed to reveal God's judgment and definitively establish guilt or innocence. This method was favored by the nobility and knights, who saw it as an honorable way to prove a point or defend their reputation, linking martial prowess directly to legal truth. Think about it. Your entire legal defense rests on how well you can fight. Imagine the preparations leading up to the duel. Each combatant would swear a solemn oath before God, often on holy relics or a Bible, that their cause was just, and that they fought with truth on their side. Priests might be present to offer prayers, blessing their weapons and the combatants themselves, further imbuing the duel with divine significance. The weapons used would be appropriate to their status and the customs of the region. A knight would use sword, shield, and perhaps a lance from horseback, aiming to unseat his opponent. A commoner might fight on foot with simpler, more brutal tools like a club, axe, or plain sword, focusing on blunt force or quick cuts. The combatants might wear armor, sometimes relatively light leather or padded cloth, sometimes heavy chainmail or even plate armor for knights, adding to both the spectacle and the sheer physical exertion required. A particularly quirky tidbit that highlights the pragmatic and sometimes strange application of trial by combat is the allowance for champions. If a party was physically incapable of fighting themselves, a woman, an elderly person, a child, or someone with a physical disability or illness, they could hire a champion, a professional fighter, to represent them in the duel. Imagine hiring a professional fighter to resolve your property dispute or defend you against a murder accusation. Their victory legally proving your claim or innocence. Historians still argue whether the widespread acceptance of trial by combat, despite its obvious dangers and potential for injustice as physical prowess, didn't necessarily equate to moral righteousness or actual guilt. Primarily served as a pragmatic means to prevent endless blood feuds by offering a definitive, if violent, resolution to disputes that might otherwise fester, or if it was simply a reflection of a deeply ingrained warrior culture that valued martial skill, personal honor, and physical strength above all else, making it a culturally ingrained, rather than purely rational, legal mechanism. Did it bring peace, or just glorify violence? The fight itself is a brutal, visceral affair. A signal sounds, perhaps a trumpet blast, and the combatants charge. You hear the deafening clang of steel on steel, the heavy thud of blows landing on armor or flesh, the grunts of exertion, and the strained breathing of the combatants. It's a desperate, unrefined dance of death, precise yet savage, where skill, strength, endurance, and sheer luck combine to determine the outcome. There are few rules beyond not fleeing or using explicitly forbidden trickery. The duel continues until one party is definitively defeated, either by death, severe injury that renders them unable to continue, or by conceding defeat aloud. If one combatant dies, their guilt or innocence is definitively proven by God's judgment, often leading to their body being publicly disgraced if found guilty, or given an honorable burial if innocent. If one yields, they are considered to have lost God's favor and are thus deemed guilty, often facing the original punishment for the crime they were accused of, or a lesser penalty for having been defeated in combat. The defeated champion, even if he survived, might face severe social disgrace, further punishment, or even execution for having failed to uphold his client's honor. The psychological pressure on the combatants is immense. Not only are they fighting for their lives, but for their honor, their reputation, and the legal outcome of a dispute that carries immense consequences for themselves and their families. The crowd watches in solemn, often morbid silence, believing they are witnessing divine will unfold before their very eyes, an unassailable judgment from God, making the arena a truly terrifying place of ultimate truth. The air is thick with tension, unspoken prayers, and the chilling anticipation of bloodlust. You feel your own heart pound, caught between the brutal reality of the violence unfolding before you and the medieval belief in its divine purpose. You watch as a man falls, his body slumping to the ground, perhaps with a final, desperate gasp, and you realize that in this chilling legal system, the ultimate arbiter of truth isn't reason, evidence, or learned argument, but the sharp edge of a blade and the raw force of human combat. The awful truth about justice in the Middle Ages isn't just about its inherent brutality. It's about the terrifying, unpredictable nature of trial by combat. Your innocence might be decided not by your honesty, but by your ability to wield a weapon, turning every legal dispute into a potential duel to the death, where might truly made right in the eyes of God and man, a testament to a brutal age. Having witnessed the raw, physical judgment of trial by combat, your understanding of medieval justice must now expand to encompass another formidable power that governed much of medieval life. Ecclesiastical courts church's grip. Forget the clear separation of church and state you know today. In the Middle Ages, the church wielded immense temporal as well as spiritual power, establishing its own parallel legal system that judged not just religious offenses, but also many aspects of daily life, often with a unique blend of moral righteousness and brutal, spiritual, and sometimes even physical punishment. You quickly learn that your soul, your reputation, and even your body could be subject to the judgment of a different kind of court, one that claimed divine sanction for its rulings, and whose grip reached into every corner of society. It's like living in a country where every citizen is subject to both government law and a parallel, equally powerful, religious law, and their jurisdictions often overlap in confusing and dangerous ways. You might find yourself summoned before a bishop's court or a local archdeacon's tribunal, typically held in a solemn setting like a cathedral chapter house, a monastery, or even a parish church. The atmosphere is distinct from the Lord's smoky, boisterous great hall. Here, there's a greater emphasis on formality, on Latin language, on written records often meticulously kept by literate clerks, and on the solemnity of religious ritual. The judges are clerics, bishops, abbots, or priests, whose authority stems from canon law, the vast and complex body of law of the Church, and their interpretation of divine will. Their primary concern is not just with earthly order, but with the moral and spiritual health of the community, and the eternal salvation of souls. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this pervasive dual legal system is that the medieval church operated an extensive and highly influential ecclesiastical court system, canon law courts across Europe, which held jurisdiction over religious matters like heresy, blasphemy, and sacrilege. Moral offenses such as adultery, usury, and slander, clerical disputes, and even some civil matters, marriage, wills, and contracts sworn by oath, applying distinct legal procedures and punishments from secular courts. This powerful legal arm of the Church often paralleled, and sometimes competed with, feudal and royal justice systems, extending its grip deep into daily life. Think about it. Your spiritual conduct could land you in a very real, very serious court. Imagine being accused of a moral transgression, perhaps adultery, public drunkenness, slander against a neighbor, usury lending money at interest, often frowned upon by the Church, or a failure to observe religious feast days. You are brought before the cleric, who sits in judgment, often with a stern and unyielding expression. Evidence might be gathered through witness testimony, but there's also a very strong emphasis on confession, repentance, and the spiritual state of the accused. The aim is often to bring the sinner to public penance, to correct moral failings, and to ensure the salvation of their soul, not just to exact earthly punishment. A particularly quirky tidbit that demonstrates the Church's surprising legal reach into daily life and its unique methods is the practice of excommunication for minor offenses or debts. If a person refused to pay a tithe to the Church, or failed to honor a promise made under oath, they could be excommunicated, cut off from the sacraments, forbidden from attending Mass, and socially shunned. This was a terrifying spiritual punishment, as it was believed to endanger one's immortal soul and often led to social and economic ruin, effectively turning you into a spiritual outcast. Imagine being blacklisted from heaven just for not paying your church taxes. Historians still argue whether the Church's extensive legal reach, by often offering a more standardized system and a pathway for appeal across wider territories, especially compared to the fragmented and often arbitrary local feudal courts, provided a more accessible or theoretically fairer form of justice for some common people, particularly in matters like marriage and wills, or if its ultimate focus on moral and spiritual control, coupled with severe spiritual penalties, made it equally, if not more, oppressive in its own way, forcing conformity through fear of damnation. Did it offer more justice, or more control, than the feudal lords? The punishments dispensed by the church courts were often different from secular penalties, focusing on spiritual correction, public penance, and social shame. For minor offenses, it might be fasting, reciting prayers, undertaking a pilgrimage, a physically arduous but spiritually beneficial journey, or making a public confession in church. For more serious moral transgressions, it could involve public humiliation, like standing barefoot in a church or wearing a penitential garment, fines which often went to the church itself, or the terrifying threat of excommunication. However, for grave offenses, especially heresy challenging church doctrine or witchcraft, remember that from Section 10 of Why Justice Sucked, the church's justice could be extremely brutal. While the church itself rarely directly inflicted capital punishment, theoretically abhorring the shedding of blood, it could, and frequently did, hand over condemned heretics, witches, or other egregious offenders to the secular authorities for execution, often by burning at the stake. This chilling collaboration between spiritual and temporal power meant that the church's moral authority could lead directly to agonizing physical ends, ensuring that the condemned not only suffered earthly torment, but also faced the prospect of eternal damnation. You recall the grim purpose of the executioner from earlier. From Section 8, punishments public, brutal, and Section 9, torture extracting confessions. His axe and the stake could serve the church's will as much as the Lord's. You feel the weight of spiritual judgment, the constant anxiety of your immortal soul being on trial. You listen to the solemn pronouncements, the Latin phrases you may not fully understand, but whose intent is chillingly clear. Your very soul is at stake. The awful truth about justice in the Middle Ages isn't just about the arbitrary whims of feudal lords or the violence of trial by combat. It's about the pervasive, often competing, authority of clergy's courts. Your life was subject to a dual legal system, one focused on earthly order, the other on eternal salvation, both capable of inflicting immense suffering, ensuring that your every action was judged, not just by man, but by the divine, with a pervasive moral authority that permeated every corner of your miserable existence, making every sin a potential crime. Even if you manage to navigate the complex, often conflicting, jurisdictions of feudal and ecclesiastical courts, avoiding the brutal direct judgments of ordeal or combat, the notion of going to prison in the Middle Ages held a very different, and often equally horrifying reality than your modern understanding prisons holding, not punishing. Forget long sentences in correctional facilities designed for rehabilitation or even fixed periods of punishment. Medieval jails were overwhelmingly squalid, overcrowded, and temporary holding pens, designed merely to contain suspects before trial, or to detain debtors and political prisoners, turning incarceration into a brief, miserable prelude to a far more brutal fate. You quickly learn that being thrown into a medieval prison isn't a sentence in itself. It's just a dirty, disease-ridden waiting room for something far worse, a place of profound discomfort and constant peril. It's like being stuck in a very grim, very smelly, eternally uncomfortable airport lounge, waiting for a flight you really don't want to board, and the flight might just be to the gallows. You find yourself shoved into a dark, damp cell, perhaps in the dungeon of a lord's castle, a tower gatehouse, a converted cellar of a town hall, or even a room in the local jailer's own home. The air is cold, heavy, and thick with the stench of human waste, unwashed bodies, stale food, and the pervasive odor of damp stone, mildew, and stale straw. There's usually no window, no natural light beyond the occasional flicker of a guard's torch or a distant sliver from a high, narrow slit in the thick walls. The sounds are a cacophony of groans, ragged coughs, the constant scurrying of rats, and the incessant drip, drip, drip of water from the ceiling, gathering in cold puddles on the floor. The primary purpose of medieval imprisonment was not punishment in itself, but rather to hold individuals until they could be brought before a court for trial, interrogated often by torture, which we'll cover soon. Section 8. Or until a ransom or fine was paid, remember how the wealthy could escape punishment. Section 10. Sentences of long-term imprisonment as a form of direct punishment for crimes were extremely rare, largely because they were incredibly expensive for the lord or city to maintain, and offered little public deterrence compared to the immediate, visible impact of corporal punishment or execution. Your time here is a temporary, miserable limbo, a period of uncertainty and profound discomfort. One mainstream historical fact that utterly redefines the function of medieval prisons is that medieval prisons were primarily temporary holding facilities for suspects awaiting trial. Debtors, or political prisoners, rather than places of long-term punishment, they were notoriously unsanitary, overcrowded, and dangerous, with disease, starvation, exposure, and violence being common causes of death for inmates. The concept of using incarceration as a direct, fixed penalty for crimes largely developed much later, often centuries after the medieval period. Think about it, you might die in jail, not from your sentence, but simply from being in jail, from the conditions alone. Imagine the living conditions. Your bed is likely a pile of vermin-infested straw on a cold, damp, earthen or stone floor. You're often chained or shackled, restricting your movement, further exacerbating your discomfort. You're crammed into tiny cells with multiple other prisoners, their bodies pressed against yours, their breath heavy in the stale air. Privacy is non-existent. Sanitation is rudimentary to non-existent. Human waste is often collected in open buckets within the cell, or simply allowed to accumulate in a corner. Attracting swarms of flies and breeding disease recall those diseases from Why You Wouldn't Survive a Day in Ancient Egypt. Section 6. The stench, overpowering and nauseating, is a constant assault on your senses. A particularly quirky tidbit that demonstrates the casual neglect and profound lack of state provision for prisoners is that, for common criminals, food and water were often not provided by the jailer as a right. Instead, prisoners were frequently reliant on charity from outside, either from sympathetic townspeople or from their own families bringing them meager provisions. If you had no family, no friends, or your family was too poor or too distant, you could literally starve to death in jail, simply for being too unfortunate to be sustained. Imagine being locked up, and your very survival depends on a random act of kindness from someone outside who tosses a stale crust of bread or a bucket of murky water into your cell. Historians still argue whether the lack of state provision for food and basic care in medieval prisons was primarily a pragmatic reflection of limited state resources and a decentralized administration, pushing the burden onto families and charity, or if it was also a deliberate, punitive measure, designed to increase suffering and coerce confessions from the accused through the threat of starvation, thereby making imprisonment itself a form of indirect torture. Was it about poverty or purposeful cruelty that made prison so dire? Disease was rampant in these overcrowded, unsanitary cells. Typhus, jail fever, dysentery, and other infectious diseases swept through the prison populations with terrifying speed, often killing more inmates than direct executions or torture. You might see fellow prisoners coughing violently, racked with fever, their bodies convulsing with agonizing digestive ailments, knowing that you too are constantly exposed to the same invisible killers, your body already weakened by fear, stress, and poor nutrition. Guards were often cruel and corrupt. They might demand bribes for better treatment, for a scrap of extra food, for a cleaner bucket, or for a moment of fresh air. Without money or influence, remember how the wealthy could buy their way out. Section 10 will clarify. You are utterly at their mercy, often subjected to arbitrary beatings or additional suffering. Physical abuse from guards or more hardened prisoners was also a constant threat. adding another layer of terror to your already miserable incarceration. The psychological toll is immense. The perpetual darkness, the relentless cold and damp, the constant fear of disease, the sounds of suffering from neighboring cells, and the gnawing uncertainty about your ultimate fate all conspire to break your spirit. You are trapped, waiting, unsure if your next journey will be to the court, the torture chamber, or the gallows. Your mind races, replaying the events that led you here, desperate for a way out, but knowing that the doors are locked and your body is slowly weakening. You feel the cold dampness seeping into your skin, the rough straw beneath your body, and the constant gnawing of hunger, even after a meager meal. You hear the scurry of rats in the absolute darkness and the distant chilling clang of a cell door closing, sealing another soul into this miserable limbo. The awful truth about justice in the Middle Ages isn't just about the brutality of its sentences. It's about the miserable, temporary nature of its prisons. Your incarceration isn't a punishment in itself, but a horrifying ordeal, a squalid, crowded, disease-ridden holding pen where survival is a daily struggle, and freedom often leads only to a harsher, more public, and utterly inescapable fate, ensuring that your suffering began long before any formal judgment. Even if you somehow manage to survive the squalid torment of a medieval prison cell, that holding pen for the accused, a far more terrifying fate often awaited those deemed uncooperative or whose guilt was not yet proven. Torture extracting confessions. Forget logical reasoning, forensic evidence, or the right to remain silent. In the Middle Ages, torture was a legally sanctioned and widely practiced method for forcing a suspect to admit guilt, implicate others, or reveal information, transforming a legal inquiry into an agonizing contest of endurance against excruciating pain. You quickly learn that truth in this era could be systematically beaten out of you, and that the silence of the dungeon walls held screams that no one would ever hear, except perhaps your tormentors. It's like being forced into a very real, very painful game, where the goal is to make you confess, and the only way to win is to break. Whether your confession is true or not, you find yourself dragged from your dismal cell and brought to a dark, damp, subterranean chamber, often within the deepest part of a castle dungeon or a city prison. The air is cold, heavy, and thick with the metallic scent of old blood, the pervasive stench of unwashed bodies, and the lingering odor of fear that permeates the very stone. Before you, various contraptions stand in the flickering torchlight, grotesque in their design, each meticulously crafted to inflict maximum pain. Wooden frames with ropes and rollers, spiked chairs, heavy iron boots, and an array of clamps, pincers, and screws. Your interrogators, often stern-faced officials, military officers, or a grim inquisitor if your case falls under the church's purview. Watch impassively, their expressions unreadable. Your torturer, often the executioner himself, remember that miserable fellow from the Miserable Life of a Medieval Executioner script. Section 9, who was torture's master. His job was tied to this grim reality. Moves with chilling efficiency. His movements practiced. His purpose clear. They are not merely seeking truth, they are asserting the absolute power of the state. And your suffering is a tool in their arsenal. One mainstream historical fact that utterly defines this grim practice is that torture was a widely accepted and legally sanctioned method used by both secular and ecclesiastical courts throughout the Middle Ages, applied to suspects particularly in serious cases like treason, heresy, or serious felony to extract confessions, obtain testimony, or implicate accomplices. With a vast array of agonizing instruments designed to inflict extreme physical pain without necessarily causing immediate death. Confessions obtained under torture were often considered legally valid, despite their inherent unreliability, serving as crucial evidence for conviction. Imagine your guilt being determined not by what you did, but by what you can endure. Imagine the initiation of the torment. Your hands might be bound, your body secured. The interrogators begin with questions, a relentless barrage, demanding names, details, and admissions of guilt. When you deny or falter, the pain begins. The thumbscrews might be applied first, a simple device, slowly crushing your fingers or toes, the grinding pressure agonizingly intense. You feel the bones protest, the ligaments stretch, the blood begin to pool. You try to resist, to grit your teeth, but the pain is searing, relentless, dulling your senses. But every turn of the screw sharpens your awareness of the agony. You hear your own strained breathing, perhaps a whimper escaping your lips, as your body rebels against the unbearable torment. A particularly quirky tidbit that demonstrates the perverse logic and occasional potential for manipulation by the torturers of these medieval ordeals is the concept that the accused must confess freely after the torture ceased. For the confession to be considered legally valid, if they confessed during the torture, it might be discounted unless reaffirmed immediately after. A twisted legal fiction that allowed for the use of extreme duress while maintaining a pretense of voluntary admission. Imagine being systematically tortured until you confess, and then immediately asked if you voluntarily admit to it, knowing that if you say no, the torture will resume. Historians still argue whether the widespread reliance on torture in medieval justice, especially for serious crimes like heresy or political conspiracies, was primarily a desperate measure born of a lack of sophisticated investigative tools like forensic science, making physical pain the only perceived way to uncover truth or extract information about hidden plots, or if it also served as a powerful tool of state terror and control, demonstrating absolute power over the individual, regardless of the actual reliability of the confessions obtained, and deterring dissent through fear of unimaginable suffering. Was it about uncovering truth or exercising raw, terrifying power that made torture so prevalent? If beatings or thumbscrews fail to break your will, or if the interrogators seek further information, the torture intensifies. You might be subjected to the strappado, where you are hoisted by your bound wrists, often with weights tied to your feet, slowly dislocating your shoulders. The agony is immense, tearing muscles and ligaments, stretching every joint. Or, for a truly agonizing test, the dreaded rack. You're bound to a large wooden frame, your wrists and ankles secured to rollers at opposite ends. Then, slowly, methodically, the torturer turns a crank, stretching your body, tearing muscles and ligaments, dislocating joints with horrifying snaps. The screams that erupt from your throat are deafening, primal, echoing off the stone walls, a sound you've become grimly accustomed to hearing from others. But now it is your own. Raw agony. You are a precise mechanic of pain, knowing exactly how far to push before the body breaks, or the mind shatters, or the desired confession is wrung out. Your knowledge of the human body, grimly acquired through this brutal profession if you are the torturer, or agonizingly experienced if you are the victim, is extensive. You know which nerves to press, which joints to target, which techniques prolong suffering without causing immediate death. This expertise is your power, but also your curse, as it enables you to inflict suffering with chilling efficiency. You are the master of pain, an unwanted but necessary professional in a system that valued confessions, however obtained, above all else. The air becomes thick with your own screams, with the smell of sweat and blood, and with the chilling silence that sometimes falls between bouts of agony, broken only by the drip of water or the scurry of rats. The outside world, the sunlight, the sounds of normal life are a distant memory. You are utterly alone. Without legal counsel, remember that absence from Section 11. No lawyers. Without recourse. A mere body and mind systematically subjected to the will of the state. If you finally confess, whether truthfully or, more likely, falsely, just to make the pain stop, the torment might cease, but your fate is sealed. Your confession, extracted under duress, will be used as undeniable proof of your guilt in court, despite being coerced. Your journey will then conclude with a public, brutal execution, which we'll explore in Section 12, often designed to be as agonizing and humiliating as possible, hanging, drawing, and quartering for treason, burning for heresy, especially common for those accused in witchcraft trials. Section 14, or simply beheading. Ensuring your death serves as a terrifying warning to others. You feel the cold, searing pain, the utter helplessness, and the profound, terrifying knowledge that your secrets, your loyalty, and your very essence are being systematically stripped away. The awful truth about being a criminal in medieval times isn't just about the initial crime or the sentence. It's about the agonizing, almost certain, reality of torture. Your brief, terrifying journey culminates in a brutal interrogation designed to break you, followed by a public, agonizing death, ensuring that even in your final moments, your life is defined by the relentless, horrifying grip of medieval justice, a chilling testament to a legal system that sought truth through torment, and where your body became the unwilling instrument of its brutal will. Even if your spirit, miraculously, somehow resisted the agonizing torments of the torture chamber, or if your crime was not deemed severe enough to warrant such interrogation, medieval justice still held a grim fate in store for you, one designed to inflict a different kind of pain. Public humiliation shames spectacle. Forget subtle deterrents or private punishments. The primary goal of medieval penalties was to inflict severe discomfort, profound public shaming, and often permanent disfigurement, all in full view of your community, transforming the village square into a stage for terrifying displays of state power and social condemnation. You quickly learn that a transgression isn't just a legal matter, it's a public performance designed to brand you, physically and socially, for life, making your very body a living warning to others, your shame a constant, visible reminder of your downfall. It's like being forced to star in a very long, very painful, very public play where the audience knows all your dirty laundry, and you can't leave the stage until your sentence is complete. You stand in the crowded market square, perhaps forced to watch, or perhaps yourself the unfortunate recipient of justice. The gallows might loom in the distance. Remember that grim finality. From Section 12, we'll get there. But for most common offenses, a different kind of horror awaits. One that strips you of dignity long before it touches your life. The air is thick with the murmur of the crowd, the cries of vendors, and a palpable sense of morbid curiosity mixed with fear. The apparatus of punishment is often simple, but chillingly effective. A heavy wooden frame, a whipping post, a ducking stool, or a heated iron. Your local officials, with grim faces, oversee the proceedings, ensuring the spectacle is properly enacted. One mainstream historical fact that utterly defines the nature of medieval retribution is that medieval punishments were predominantly public, brutal, and often involved severe corporal harm, mutilation, or public humiliation like the stocks, pillory, flogging, or branding, meticulously designed to deter crime through fear and visual example, physically mark offenders, and assert social control in a highly visible and unforgettable manner. The goal was less about incarceration. Prisons were temporary, remember Section 7, and more about immediate, tangible pain and pervasive shame. Imagine being led to the stocks or the pillory for minor offenses like public drunkenness, disturbing the peace, petty theft, or vagrancy. You might find your feet locked in heavy wooden planks, the stocks, or your head and hands clamped into holes on an upright wooden frame, the pillory. You're exposed to the elements, the sun, the rain, the cold, and utterly at the mercy of the crowd. They might jeer, shout insults, throw rotten vegetables, stale bread, or even animal dung at you. The shame is immense, burning hotter than any physical discomfort, as your reputation, so vital in a close-knit medieval community, is publicly shattered before everyone you know. You are rendered helpless, a living target for the community's disdain, a public object lesson for all to see. A particularly quirky tidbit that demonstrates the crude but creative medieval ingenuity of public humiliation is the design of specialized shaming devices, or masks. For example, a gossip or scold might be forced to wear a scold's bridle, or brank, an iron muzzle clamped onto the head, sometimes with a spiked plate entering her mouth to prevent speech, while she was paraded through town or made to stand in the marketplace. A dishonest baker might be forced to wear a baker's pillory, a heavy wooden collar resembling a large, stale pretzel or loaf of bread. Imagine being punished by wearing a giant, humiliating hat that literally brands you as a specific kind of offender, making your shame visible to everyone from miles away, ensuring that your walk of shame is as literal as it is painful. Historians still argue whether the primary effectiveness of public punishments, like shaming devices or floggings, lay in their physical pain, or in the profound psychological torment of public dishonor and social ostracism, in a society where reputation and community belonging were paramount, making the social consequences arguably worse and longer lasting than the physical ones. Was it the whip or the watchful, judging eyes of your neighbors? That hurt most. For more serious offenses, or for repeat offenders who hadn't learned their lesson from the pillory, corporal punishment became more brutal and direct. Flogging, or whipping, was common. You would be stripped to the waist, perhaps tied to a post in the market square or to the tail of a cart, and lashed repeatedly with a whip, a rod, or a bundle of sticks. Each blow would tear into your skin, leaving searing welts, the pain agonizing. The cries of the punished man, a common sound in medieval towns, would echo through the square, a chilling reminder of the state's unyielding power. The goal was not just pain, but the public display of your suffering. The executioner, remember that miserable fellow from Section 8 of Miserable Life of a Medieval Executioner, or a bailiff, would administer the blows, their impassive faces reflecting their professional detachment. The sheer brutality was designed to both punish the individual and terrify the onlookers, reinforcing the boundaries of acceptable behavior. You feel the cold dread of knowing that your own body is about to become a public spectacle, a canvas for the grim message of justice. You taste the dust of the ground, the metallic tang of fear, and the searing pain that shoots through your body with each blow. You try to suppress your cries, to maintain a semblance of dignity, but the relentless agony often breaks you. The awful truth about being a criminal in medieval times isn't just about the initial accusation or the trial. It's about the horrifying, omnipresent reality of public, brutal punishments. Your slightest misstep could lead to agonizing pain, profound humiliation, and permanent disfigurement, ensuring that the consequences of crime were etched not just in legal records, but in the very flesh and memory of the community. A constant, horrifying spectacle of state power that left a permanent, unshakable mark on your life. Even as you witness the public humiliation and the brutal lashings of common criminals, a stark and often infuriating reality quickly becomes apparent, fundamentally undermining any notion of universal fairness in medieval justice. Fines and vergiled wealthies escape. Forget the principle of equality before the law. In the Middle Ages, money, and particularly the ability to pay, often served as a powerful shield, allowing the rich to escape the harsher physical penalties that were the grim, unavoidable reality for the poor. You quickly learn that your social status and the size of your purse could literally determine whether you walked free with a financial penalty or faced the gallows, the torture chamber, or the public square, turning justice into a commodity that could be bought and sold. It's like playing a game where the rules are different for those who can afford to bribe the referee, and everyone else just gets brutalized. You stand in the Lord's court, or perhaps hear a judgment pronounced by a church official. Remember those ecclesiastical courts from Section 6. A wealthy merchant, a prosperous landowner, or a minor noble is accused of a serious offense, perhaps causing grievous bodily harm in a drunken brawl, a significant act of fraud, or even accidental manslaughter. Instead of being dragged to the stocks as you just saw in Section 9, or facing a terrifying ordeal from Section 4, the discussion quickly turns to compensation, his family, his connections, and most importantly, his immense wealth allow him a different, far less painful, path to justice. One mainstream historical fact that utterly defines this class-based application of justice is that the medieval legal system often allowed wealthy individuals to pay substantial fines or compensation payments vergiled for serious crimes like murder, or other financial penalties directly to victims or the authorities, thereby avoiding corporal punishment, mutilation, or execution, a privilege largely inaccessible to the poor who faced much harsher physical retribution for similar offenses. This economic disparity was a fundamental characteristic of medieval justice, where money could literally buy your freedom from pain, shame, and death. Think about it. Your life's value could literally be a price tag. Imagine the negotiations. If the crime involved physical harm or death, the victim's family, or the Lord, would be offered a substantial weregild, literally man payment, a concept deeply rooted in Germanic and Norse law. Remember that from Why Justice Sucked. Section 7. This amount, often meticulously calculated based on the victim's social status, would be negotiated and agreed upon. Accepting the weregild meant that the injured party, or the victim's family, formally renounced their right to vengeance, and the crime was settled, bringing an end to the dispute, effectively buying off retribution outside of physical punishment. For lesser offenses, a direct fine to the Lord or the church might be levied. The amount would be significant, a heavy burden even for the wealthy, perhaps requiring them to sell off some property or incur debt, but infinitely preferable to losing an eye, a hand, or your life. A particularly quirky tidbit that highlights the pragmatic and sometimes cynical nature of these fines and their economic impact is the fact that the revenue from these penalties often went directly into the coffers of the Lord or the church, providing a financial incentive for justice to be rendered, even if it meant a wealthy individual escaped harsher physical consequences. Imagine a legal system where the judge gets a cut of the fines, potentially influencing his decisions, and the punishment for the rich becomes a source of profit for the powerful. Historians still argue whether the Wehrgild system and the prevalence of fines, by providing a non-violent, economic alternative to physical punishment and escalating blood feuds which could destabilize a region, inadvertently contributed to greater social stability and economic efficiency by preserving valuable skilled labor and wealth, or if they fundamentally served to entrench social inequality, allowing the rich to literally escape justice and perpetuating a two-tiered system where justice was consistently for sale. Did it foster peace, or simply entrench inequality? For the common peasant, the struggling artisan, or the impoverished laborer, facing the same accusation, the story would be vastly different. Without land, without significant silver, without accumulated wealth, their inability to pay a substantial fine or offer Wehrgild meant they were almost automatically shunted towards the more brutal, physical punishments. A small theft by a poor man might lead to him losing a hand, which we'll discuss in Section 11, or spending time in the stocks, while a large embezzlement by a wealthy merchant might only result in a hefty fine. The difference wasn't the nature of the crime, it was the size of the purse. You see the stark disparity playing out constantly. The Lord's personal favor, or the church's willingness to accept a large donation or a generous contribution to a local monastery, could also subtly sway the outcome, implicitly turning a blind eye to transgressions of the wealthy while relentlessly pursuing the poor. The very infrastructure of justice, the bailiffs, the clerks, the local enforcers, often benefited directly from this system, further entrenching the power of wealth and privilege. You feel the burning injustice, the cold awareness that your fate in the medieval legal system is fundamentally and irrevocably linked to your economic standing. You watch a rich man walk away with a lightened purse but an intact body, knowing that a poorer man would have faced the whip, the branding iron, or the gallows for far less, simply because he had no coin. The awful truth about justice in the Middle Ages isn't just about its inherent brutality. It's about the pervasive, systemic reality of wealthy justice. Your ability to pay a fine or offer Wehrgild often shielded you from the horrifying physical penalties, ensuring that for the vast majority of the population, justice truly sucked, remaining an unequal, arbitrary, and often excruciating ordeal where money literally bought your way out of misery, leaving the poor to bear the full, brutal weight of the law. Even if you lacked the wealth to buy your way out of trouble, and your crime wasn't deemed serious enough for immediate execution. Medieval justice still ensured that your transgression would be permanently etched upon your very being. Mutilation bodies branding. Forget a temporary stint in the stocks or a few lashes from a whip. For many offenses, and particularly for repeat offenders, the punishment involved deliberately disfiguring your body, leaving a horrifying, indelible mark that branded you as a criminal for life, robbing you of dignity and ensuring your social ostracism. You quickly learn that medieval justice didn't just punish, it branded, transforming your flesh into a living billboard of your shame, a constant, visible reminder of your downfall. It's like having a permanent, very painful tattoo that literally screams criminal to everyone you meet, forever. You stand in the public square, Perhaps after having endured the stocks or a flogging, remember those public humiliation spectacles from Section 9. The crowd is still present. Their morbid curiosity still piqued. The implements are brought forth by the executioner. Remember that miserable fellow from Miserable Life of a Medieval Executioner. His job was certainly tied to this grim duty, a sharp knife, a heated iron, or perhaps even a pair of specialized shears. A cold dread washes over you as you realize that this punishment will not simply cause temporary pain. It will change you forever, leaving a physical testament to your crime. One mainstream historical fact that utterly defines this barbaric aspect of medieval punishment is that judicial mutilation, such as the cutting off of hands, ears, or tongues, or blinding, and branding with hot irons, was a common and legally sanctioned punishment in medieval Europe for various crimes, particularly theft, perjury, and repeat offenses, designed to permanently mark offenders, deter future crime, and publicly signify their disgraced status. It was a brutal form of public identification and perpetual shame. Think about it. Your punishment isn't just about pain. It's about making sure everyone knows you're a criminal, just by looking at you. Imagine the specific disfigurement. For theft, particularly repeated theft, a common punishment was the severing of a hand. You would be forced to place your hand on a chopping block, and with a single, swift blow, the executioner's axe or cleaver would sever your limb. The pain would be unimaginable, blinding, instantly turning your world into a maelstrom of agony. The stump would be crudely bandaged, perhaps cauterized with a hot iron to stop the bleeding. Recall how painful and unhygienic even basic medical care was from how brutal Roman entertainment was. Section 10. But the risk of infection from those invisible killers we discussed from Why You Wouldn't Survive a Day in Ancient Egypt. Section 6 would be immense, often leading to gangrene and a slow, agonizing death. A particularly quirky tidbit that demonstrates the grim symbolism of these mutilations is the choice of body part. A perjurer, someone who lied under oath, might have their tongue pierced or cut out, literally silencing their ability to lie again. A spy or a gossip might have their ears cropped, symbolizing their failure to hear or speak truth, or their intrusion into secrets. These weren't just random acts of violence, they were highly symbolic punishments, designed to match the crime with the disfigurement, physically branding the offender as a specific type of criminal. Imagine committing a specific crime, and knowing that your punishment would be a permanent, symbolic alteration of your body part, linking it forever to your transgression. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of mutilation as a form of medieval punishment was primarily a pragmatic solution for incapacitating repeat offenders and visibly identifying criminals in a society without modern prisons or extensive records, thereby serving as an effective deterrent, or if it was also a reflection of a deeper cultural belief in retributive justice and the symbolic cleansing of sin through physical suffering and permanent bodily alteration. Was it pragmatic deterrence or ritualistic vengeance that drove such disfigurement? Branding with a hot iron was another common form of mutilation, particularly for certain types of theft, desertion from military service, or repeat vagrancy. You would be held down, and a glowing hot iron, shaped into a letter like T for thief, or M for malefactor, or a specific symbol, would be pressed onto your flesh, often on your forehead, cheek, or hand. The searing pain, the smell of burning flesh, and the permanent scar would serve as an undeniable mark, signaling your criminal status to everyone you encountered. The psychological toll of mutilation was profound. You would live with the constant physical pain of the healed or poorly healed wound, but also with the crushing weight of public shame and social ostracism. Your disfigurement would precede you, denying you opportunities for work, marriage, or acceptance in any community. You would be forever marked, a visible reminder of your past, condemned to a life on the fringes of society. People would recoil from your presence, whisper behind your back, and your very existence would serve as a grim warning to others. You feel the searing pain, the sudden shock, and the profound, chilling realization that your body is no longer entirely your own. It has been permanently altered by the harsh hand of justice. You see the disfigured faces of others, and you understand their silent suffering. The awful truth about being a criminal in medieval times isn't just about the initial crime or the sentence. It's about the horrifying, pervasive reality of mutilation. Your body is branded, permanently marked for your transgression, ensuring that your shame is a visible, inescapable burden. Your existence becomes a living monument to medieval retribution, a constant, agonizing reminder that justice, in this era, left indelible scars not just on your life, but on your very flesh, condemning you to a brutal public and often solitary existence. Even if you manage to endure the agony of torture, avoid the lasting shame of mutilation, and escape the squalid confines of a medieval prison for the most serious crimes, a final, terrifying fate awaited execution grim finality. Forget quiet, private ends, or respectful burials. Medieval executions were overwhelmingly public, brutal, and meticulously orchestrated spectacles, designed not just to punish, but to terrify, to humiliate, and to assert the absolute power of the state over the individual, transforming the village square into a chilling stage for ultimate retribution. You quickly learn that your life, if deemed forfeit, would become a horrifying final performance for a roaring, often bloodthirsty crowd, ensuring your death served as a stark, unforgettable warning. It's like being forced to star in a snuff film, but it's live, and the audience is your entire community, eagerly watching your final, agonizing moments. You stand bound, perhaps on a cart or led on foot, as you are paraded through the crowded streets of the town. The air is thick with the murmur of the crowd, the cries of vendors, some still hawking wares, others selling simple food and drink to the spectators, and a palpable sense of morbid curiosity mixed with fear. Ahead, the gallows loom, a stark wooden structure silhouetted against the sky, or perhaps a burning stake awaits. This is not a hidden act. It's a central, terrifying event in medieval public life, eagerly anticipated by all social classes, from the nobles in their windows to the commoners jostling for a better view. One mainstream historical fact that utterly defines this horrifying aspect of medieval justice is that public execution was the ultimate and most common punishment for serious crimes like murder, treason, rape, or heresy in medieval Europe, performed through brutal methods such as hanging, beheading, burning at the stake, or drawing and quartering, meticulously staged as a deterrent, a demonstration of state power, and a communal ritual. The explicit public display of suffering and death was central to its purpose. Think about it. Your local town square isn't just for markets. It's also where people are publicly killed. Imagine the procession to the gallows. You might be accompanied by a priest, offering last rites and urging repentance. The crowd, often a mix of solemn observers, curious onlookers, and outright jeerers, would follow. Your crime, perhaps detailed on a placard hung around your neck, would be announced loudly, ensuring everyone knew why you were about to die. Every step is agonizingly slow, a deliberate prolongation of your final moments, designed to maximize the spectacle and the terror. A particularly quirky tidbit that demonstrates the Romans and subsequent medieval societies' morbid creativity and sometimes subtle legal distinctions is the choice of execution method. Hanging was common for common criminals. Beheading, by axe or sword, was often reserved for nobles or those of higher status, considered a more honorable and swift death than strangulation. Burning at the stake was primarily for heretics, and witches remember those witchcraft trials from section 14, signifying the purification of their soul and the land from perceived evil. Imagine having your execution method determined by your social class or your specific religious crime, as if one brutal death could be more dignified than another. Historians still argue whether the extreme brutality and public nature of medieval executions were primarily pragmatic tools for maintaining social order through terrifying deterrence in societies lacking effective police forces, or if they also served a deeper psychological and ritualistic purpose, satisfying a societal thirst for retribution, providing a form of macabre entertainment, and reinforcing a profound belief in cosmic justice and the consequence of sin. Was it about controlling the populace or satisfying their bloodlust that made executions so public? You arrive at the gallows. The executioner remember that miserable life of an executioner. Section 1 of that script, often masked or dressed in a distinctive uniform, stands ready. His tools, the rope, the axe. Remember those brutal tools from section 5 of Miserable Life of a Medieval Executioner laid out. You are given a final chance to speak, perhaps to confess, to beg for mercy, or to declare your innocence one last time, your voice trembling or defiant, swallowed by the murmur of the crowd. The rope is placed around your neck, rough and unforgiving. The view from the gallows platform is terrifyingly clear. A sea of faces, rows upon rows of onlookers, all focused on you. Then, the trapdoor opens beneath your feet, or the cart is pulled away. The fall is swift. The snap of your neck, if mercifully clean quick, or the slow agony of strangulation as your body struggles. The crowd gasps, then murmurs, some turning away, others watching intently. For particularly heinous crimes like treason, the execution could be even more gruesome. Drawing and quartering, where the condemned was dragged, disemboweled, and then torn into 4 pieces, was a horrific example, designed to inflict maximum pain and dishonor. After death, your body might be left hanging in chains in a gibbet at a crossroads or city entrance as discussed in section 10 of Miserable Life of a Medieval Executioner, a grisly warning to all who passed. Its slow decay, a constant reminder of the state's power. You feel the cold dread of finality, the raw terror of knowing your last moments are a public spectacle, and the profound, chilling awareness that your life is about to be extinguished. The awful truth about being a criminal in medieval times isn't just about the initial crime or the trial. It's about the horrifying, omnipresent reality of execution. Your death is not just an ending. It's a public performance of grim justice, a brutal ritual designed to terrify and control, ensuring that your final moments were consumed by the merciless will of the state. A chilling and unforgettable testament to the ultimate price of transgression in the Middle Ages. Even if you managed to evade the agonizing reality of torture and escaped the grim finality of public execution, a different, perhaps more insidious and terrifying fate awaited those deemed beyond the pale of society outlawry living death. Forget mere confinement in a squalid prison. This wasn't imprisonment. but a profound legal banishment, stripping you of all rights, protections, and social standing, forcing you to exist as a legal non-person, a wolf's head, whom anyone could kill without legal consequence. You quickly learn that being cast out from the community isn't just about leaving your home. It's about losing your very humanity, becoming a perpetual fugitive in your own land, condemned to a life worse than death for many, a slow, agonizing process of erasure. It's like being legally erased from existence, a ghost in a world that can legally kill you with impunity, and no one is allowed to help you. You hear the solemn, chilling pronouncement at the Lord's court, or perhaps from a royal official you are declared an outlaw. The words resonate with a terrifying finality. Your former lord, your neighbors, even your family, are now legally absolved of any duty or obligation towards you. To aid you, to offer you food or shelter, is to risk becoming an outlaw themselves, facing the same grim fate. You are severed from the very fabric of society, cut adrift into an unforgiving, hostile world that was once your home. One mainstream historical fact that utterly defines this brutal punishment is that outlawry was one of the most severe forms of medieval punishment, particularly prevalent in England, rendering the condemned a caput lupinum wolf's head, meaning they lost all legal protection and could be killed on sight by anyone without legal repercussion, effectively placing them outside the law and social order. It was considered a fate worse than physical execution by many, as it denied them a proper burial, any legal remembrance, and often meant a slow, agonizing death from exposure or starvation. Think about it. Your punishment is to literally become prey. Imagine the sudden, profound silence that follows the declaration. Your few meager possessions are confiscated. Your land, if you had any, seized. Your name, your reputation, your very identity, everything that defined you within the community, is wiped clean, replaced by the grim, dehumanizing label of outlaw. Your kinsmen, who may have stood by you during the trial, remember those not-so-peerful juries from Section 12, now avert their gaze, their faces a mixture of sorrow and grim acceptance. Their loyalty, however strong, is legally superseded by the law's decree, forcing them to abandon you to your fate. A particularly quirky tidbit that highlights the dehumanizing aspect of outlawry is that in some legal interpretations, the outlaw was not only treated like a wolf, but could even be killed and skinned like one, with the killer presenting the wolf's head, the outlaw's head, to the authorities for a bounty. Imagine being hunted, not just to be killed, but to be stripped of your very skin as proof of your demise, treated no better than a wild animal. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of outlawry was to deter crime through extreme social shame and terrifying physical danger, making it a powerful public example, or if it also served a practical function by conveniently removing disruptive individuals from the community in a way that avoided the messy complications and moral dilemmas of state-sanctioned capital punishment, effectively letting the wilderness or opportunistic individuals do the execution. Was it about deterrence or convenient disposal that made outlawry so prevalent? You are cast out, forced to flee the familiar confines of your village, the fields you know, the roads you've walked. Every stranger you encounter is a potential killer, every isolated dwelling a place of danger. You cannot appeal to any court, for you have no legal standing, no rights, no voice. You cannot buy food or seek shelter openly, for interacting with you risks legal repercussions for others. Your very existence is now a crime punishable by death, at anyone's hand, without consequence. Survival as an outlaw was an immense, near impossible challenge. You would have to live off the land, foraging for meager sustenance in forests, sheltering in caves or hidden groves, constantly vigilant for bounty hunters, disgruntled locals, or simply anyone seeking to gain favor with the Lord by bringing in an outlaw's head. The harsh medieval winters remember those brutal conditions from Why Building a Castle Sucked. Section 12. Even without being underground would be your most relentless enemy, without the warmth of a hearth or the protection of a proper roof. You would be constantly hungry, perpetually cold, and eternally afraid, your body and spirit slowly breaking under the strain. Some outlaws, driven by utter desperation, eventually turned to banditry themselves, preying on travelers or isolated farmsteads, becoming the very criminals they were branded as. Others simply vanished into the vast, untamed wilderness, succumbing to starvation, exposure. Illness, recall those invisible killers from Why You Wouldn't Survive a Day in Ancient Egypt. Section 6. Or the blades of those who found them. There were stories, of course, of legendary outlaws like Robin Hood, figures of awe and dread, who somehow survived for years. But these were the rare, romanticized exceptions, usually operating with the secret sympathy of local populations or in very remote, unpoliced areas. The psychological toll is immense. The profound loneliness, the constant paranoia, the complete loss of identity, and the gnawing certainty that you are hunted, that your life has no value in the eyes of society. These are burdens that would crush your spirit far more effectively than any physical torture. Remember that reality from Section 8. You are a living death, a ghost walking among the living, forever condemned by the law, isolated in your own terrifying existence. You feel the cold wind on your face, the vast, unforgiving landscape stretching before you, and the chilling realization that every step you take as an outlaw is a step further into a living nightmare, where the only justice is the unforgiving embrace of the wild, and your only companions are fear and the ghosts of your former life. The awful truth about being a criminal in medieval times isn't just about its brutality or its explicit punishments. It's about the terrifying finality of outlawry. Your life could be legally extinguished without a single drop of blood being shed by an executioner, condemning you to a miserable, hunted existence, a permanent outcast in your own land, a living testament to why justice truly sucked in the Middle Ages, leaving you utterly alone in your suffering. Even if you managed to evade the living death of outlawry, and your crime was purely secular. Another chilling and deeply irrational fear often gripped medieval communities, transforming suspicion into deadly accusations. Witchcraft, Yathos heresy, irrational fear. Forget clear evidence or logical reasoning. In this era, a poor harvest, a sick child, an unexpected death, or even a sudden storm could be blamed on malevolent magic or a deviation from orthodox religious belief, turning innocent individuals into targets of mass hysteria and brutal judicial proceedings. You quickly learn that in this world, merely being old, unpopular, possessing unusual knowledge, or holding a slightly different religious view could lead you to face accusations of consorting with dark forces, and your trial would be a terrifying descent into the absurd, driven by profound societal anxieties and fueled by the cruelest superstitions. It's like being caught in a terrifying play where the script is written by mass paranoia, and you're arbitrarily cast as the villain, with no hope of changing the ending because the audience genuinely believes you are evil. You find yourself in a village, perhaps your own, where whispers have begun to spread. A persistent drought has withered the crops. Livestock are dying mysteriously. Or a child has fallen ill with a strange, wasting fever. Remember those invisible killers. Disease from our Why You Wouldn't Survive a Day in Ancient Egypt script. Section 6. They were often blamed on others. Fingers begin to point, subtly at first, then with increasing certainty, towards an individual. It might be an old woman living alone on the outskirts of the village, known for her herbal remedies, or a newcomer with unfamiliar customs, whose different ways breed distrust. The air becomes thick with suspicion, fear, and a terrifying blend of religious fervor and ancient folk belief, creating a toxic atmosphere where reason has no place. One mainstream historical fact that utterly defines the terrifying irrationality of this form of medieval justice is that witchcraft accusations and heresy trials, particularly prevalent from the late Middle Ages into the early modern period, were characterized by reliance on dubious evidence, like spectral testimony, physical marks, or forced confessions, coercive torture, and often led to public execution by burning, driven by widespread superstition, religious fanaticism, and profound societal anxieties. These trials were a terrifying manifestation of unchecked fear and a profound lack of scientific or legal understanding, turning fear into a weapon against the innocent. Imagine being accused of flying on a broomstick or transforming into an animal, and your defense is utterly irrelevant to a judge who is convinced of your guilt by supernatural proof. Imagine the accusation. It might start with a muttered curse you supposedly uttered, a sudden misfortune that befell someone you had a quarrel with, or a strange dream a neighbor had about you. The accusation, however flimsy its basis, quickly escalates. People who once knew you now eye you with terror, convinced that you possess malevolent powers or are in league with demons. The local lord, or, more often, a church official. Remember those clergy's courts from Section 6. They held primary jurisdiction over heresy and witchcraft, but often collaborated with secular powers, takes up the case. The process often bypasses normal legal procedures, driven by a terrifying urgency to root out evil from the community. A particularly quirky tidbit that demonstrates the perverse and circular logic of these trials is the use of witch tests, or ordeals. Remember those from Section 4, Divine Gamble, like trial by water or hot iron. They took on a particularly sinister turn here. For instance, the infamous swimming test for witches involved tying the accused, often women, and throwing them into a body of water. If they floated, it was proof that the pure water rejected their sinful, witchly body, condemning them as guilty. If they sank, they were considered innocent, as the water accepted them, but often drowned in the process. Imagine your life being forfeit regardless of the outcome, simply because you were suspected of being a witch. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of witchcraft and heresy trials in the later Middle Ages and early modern period was primarily a direct result of the Church's intensified campaign against heresy and pre-Christian folk magic. Seeking to consolidate its spiritual authority and impose religious uniformity, or if it was more deeply rooted in broader societal anxieties like plague, famine, and social unrest that could not be rationally explained that led communities to seek scapegoats, with religious doctrine providing the framework for persecution and emotional outlet for collective fear. Was it theological imperative or societal panic that fueled the fury? The evidence presented against you would be terrifyingly flimsy. Hearsay, rumors spread by fearful neighbors, personal grudges twisted into malicious accusations, and the testimony of frightened or outright malicious individuals. A birthmark on your body might be interpreted as a devil's mark, an insensitive spot when pricked by a witch pricker, a cruel proof tool. Even your own confession, extracted under agonizing torture, remember that brutal reality from Section 8, would be used as undeniable proof of your malevolent pact. The concept of actual, tangible, rational proof was largely absent, replaced by fear-driven interpretations. The fear of witches and heretics was pervasive, driven by religious teachings that demonized folk magic and by widespread superstition. Communities genuinely believed that these individuals could blight crops, sicken livestock, cause illness, stir up storms, or corrupt souls through unseen curses and demonic pacts. This collective terror meant that once accused, your fate was often sealed, regardless of your actual innocence or lack of malevolent intent. The trials themselves could be public spectacles, drawing large crowds who were both terrified and eager to witness divine justice, or the punishment of perceived evil. The atmosphere would be highly charged, fueled by religious fervor and mass hysteria, leaving little room for rational thought, compassion, or a fair defense. You, the accused, would be utterly alone. Your protests of innocence drowned out by the shouts of the accusers and the grim pronouncements of the judge. If found guilty, the punishment was often execution, usually by burning at the stake, especially in areas with strong church influence, to purify the land of the perceived evil and condemn the witch's soul to eternal damnation. A chilling form of spiritual justice. You feel the cold fear gripping your heart, the profound helplessness of being caught in a maelstrom of irrationality and mass hysteria. You try to protest your innocence, to explain away the absurd accusations, but your words are meaningless, lost in the rising tide of suspicion. The collective gaze of your neighbors, now transformed into a judging, condemning crowd. The awful truth about being a criminal or accused in medieval times isn't just about common law infractions. It's about the terrifying, unpredictable fury of witchcraft and heresy trials. Your very life could be condemned by superstition, by flimsy accusations, and by a pervasive belief in dark magic, turning your trial into a nightmarish descent into irrationality, where fear, not facts, dictated your agonizing fate and often led to a fiery, public, and utterly unjust end. After enduring the chilling accusations fueled by rumor, the arbitrary justice of feudal lords, the terrifying gambles of ordeal and combat, the powerful moral authority of the church's courts, the squalid miseries of prisons, the agonizing torments of torture, the public shame of mutilation, the escape bought by the wealthy, the grim finality of execution, the living death of outlawry, and the terrifying irrationality of witchcraft and heresy trials. You finally emerge from our journey through medieval justice to confront its complex and enduring legacy foundations of modern law. The seemingly chaotic and brutal legal systems of the Middle Ages, for all their inherent flaws and profound cruelties, were not static. They were a dynamic crucible where ancient customs met new ideas, gradually laying the groundwork for many of the legal principles and institutions we recognize and rely on today, however imperfectly. You realize that the very concept of justice in your modern world, with its emphasis on evidence, rights, and due process, owes a surprising, often uncomfortable debt to these challenging centuries. It's like looking at a rough, unpolished stone and realizing it contains the raw, fundamental material for a magnificent, enduring edifice, built over centuries by countless hands. You reflect on the stark contrasts between then and now. The direct personal justice administered by a feudal lord seems primitive compared to your modern, centralized court systems. Yet it highlighted the fundamental importance of maintaining local order and resolving disputes within a community. Even if the methods were arbitrary, the terrifying ordeals and combats, though rooted in superstition and often horrific, were desperate attempts to find truth where tangible evidence was lacking. A crude, sometimes misguided, precursor to more rational forms of inquiry. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this profound evolutionary process is that the fragmented and often brutal medieval justice systems, through their reliance on customary law, the development of royal and common law, the gradual incorporation of Roman and canon law principles, and the evolution of judicial procedures, gradually developed foundational concepts like the adversarial trial, legal precedents stare decisis, and eventually the independent jury, which directly contributed to the formation of modern Western legal systems. It was a slow, often violent, and messy metamorphosis, but a significant one that fundamentally reshaped legal thought and practice. Think about it, the very idea of a jury trial, a cornerstone of many modern legal systems, began its slow, imperfect journey in these confusing medieval courts. Imagine the painstaking process of legal development. While early medieval law was primarily oral and customary, remember that legal system unwritten confused. The gradual rediscovery of Roman law, the systematic development of canon law by the Church, recall those clergy's courts and their parallel legal system, and the increasing power of kings, which led to more centralized king's courts, slowly began to introduce elements of written statutes. Trained legal professionals, though not lawyers for the common person initially, and more formalized procedures. This was a long, often contentious dialogue between ingrained tradition, religious doctrine, and nascent royal authority, each vying for influence and contributing bits and pieces to the evolving legal tapestry. A particularly quirky tidbit that demonstrates the persistent nature of old ways and the eventual shift is how certain forms of medieval justice, like trial by ordeal, often continued in popular belief or informal practice long after they were officially abolished by secular or ecclesiastical authorities. For example, the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 effectively condemned many ordeals, and common law slowly superseded them. Imagine people still believing in the witch's ducking stool, a method of public humiliation from Section 9, and related to witchcraft trials from Section 14, or the efficacy of a trial by hot iron, long after they were legally discarded, highlighting the deep-seated hold of superstition on popular justice that took centuries to fully diminish. Historians still argue whether the transition from ordeal-based and combat-based justice to more evidence-based, even if rudimentary legal systems, was primarily driven by intellectual advancements and a growing skepticism about divine intervention, signaling a move towards reason, or if it was more a pragmatic response to the Church's desire for greater control over legal processes and the state's need for more predictable methods of social control. Revenue generation through fines. Remember Section 10's wealthy's escape, and a less chaotic means of establishing guilt. Was it about reason or about power and pragmatism that drove legal reform? The development of common law in England, for instance, was a gradual process where royal judges, traveling across the kingdom, would apply similar rulings in similar cases, slowly creating a body of consistent legal precedents, stare decisis that began to transcend purely local custom. The jury system, which you faced in medieval times, remember those not-so-peerful juries from Section 12, often biased and lacking impartiality, eventually evolved from being witnesses to character into independent arbiters of fact. a fundamental shift that took centuries and fundamentally changed the nature of trials. Even the harsh punishments, the public floggings, mutilations, remember those permanent bodies branding marks from Section 11, and executions, Section 12's grim finality, eventually gave way to a greater emphasis on imprisonment, which was largely just a temporary holding pen before, from Section 7. This shift, while still far from humane by modern standards, marked a move towards a more controlled, less public display of state power, and a different, though still developing, understanding of how to manage and correct offenders. The very spectacle of the executioner, remember that miserable life, so central to medieval justice, eventually faded from public view, a testament to changing societal sensibilities. You feel the slow grind of history, the gradual evolution of ideas, as the raw, often terrifying, methods of the Middle Ages slowly gave way to more structured, if still imperfect, legal frameworks. The fundamental demand for order, for a way to resolve disputes and punish transgressions, remained constant. But the methods evolved, driven by changing social, religious, and political landscapes, inch by agonizing inch, towards what we now understand as justice. The awful truth about why justice sucked in the Middle Ages is a powerful reminder of how far our legal systems have come, and the immense human suffering that paved the way for modern notions of fairness, evidence, and due process. Their messy, brutal, and often arbitrary justice, however flawed, was a necessary stage in the long, tortuous journey of defining law, morality, and social order, leaving an enduring legacy that, for all its discomfort, laid the crucial foundations for the complex, nuanced legal world you inhabit today, proving that even the most broken systems can contain the seeds of future progress, a testament to humanity's unending, often painful, quest for a better, more just way of life. Now, as the shadows of medieval trials fade and the chaos of feudal courts grows quiet, let the stillness of your room embrace you. The brutal punishments, the arbitrary judgments, and the grim realities of medieval justice are safely in the past, part of a history that now dissolves into the gentle hum of your fan. You've journeyed through a world where justice was a perilous gamble, and now, it's time for you to find your own peaceful rest. Let your mind unwind, your muscles relax, and sink into a deep, undisturbed sleep, far from the chaotic courts and harsh decrees of the Middle Ages. End of script. Sweet dreams.